Hey coders, and welcome to episode 1 of our Data Studio Service playlist on the Google Apps Script course. In today's episode, we're going to be covering the manifest file, as well as the first step to building out a community connector, which is handling that connector's authentication. So the top 5 methods which I have prepared for today are new auth type response, setAuthType, setHelp URL, new setCredentials response, and finally setIsValid. So let's go on over to the code and learn how to implement authentication within your community connector. No matter what type of community connector you are building out, in order for you to use and publish this connector, you're going to need to add some additional data to something called an appsscript.json manifest file. So how do you actually access and modify this file? Well, you're going to need to go over to your project settings tab in the left-hand side and select this checkbox that says show appsscript.json manifest in editor. Once you do, you can go back to your editor and then you'll see now this file appsscript.json revealed to you. So this file is a manifest file that just includes additional metadata about your project. And in order for you to deploy and publish your community connector to Data Studio, you're going to need to add the property Data Studio. This Data Studio property is going to be an object, again, that has some additional metadata about your project. So what data do we actually need to include within this property? Well, if we go to the documentation, the manifest reference documentation, we can see that we have some required properties that need to be added underneath the Data Studio property itself. They are name, company URL, and a couple more. Additionally, we have some optional properties that we can add, such as the privacy policy URL, and a fee type, some templates, but for the simplicity of this episode, we're just going to stick with the required properties. So the data that we are going to be using in this playlist and connecting to our Data Studio is from Nomics. So Nomics provides an API that lets you access cryptocurrency data such as prices from cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. So I have gone and pre-written out a lot of the data already for this property, just for the sake of time. So let me uncomment to that. I'll copy it and paste it right here. So the name of our Data Studio Community Connector is going to be Nomics, which is, again, the company name of the data that we are accessing. All right, and then we can give it a description. I'll say the unofficial connector to access Nomics cryptocurrency data. For me, I'm just going to add my name as the company, but if you have your own bona fide company, then you can put the LLC name or the corporation name right here. All right, so now we're going to need a logo URL. So this logo is going to be displayed next to our community connector as an image. So all I'm going to do for that is just Google the Nomics logo, and this one is a nice, clear, and crisp image of the Nomics logo. So let me copy that image address, and then I'll paste it in its respective spot. All right, the next thing that we need is something called an add-on URL. So let's check out what that means. All right, so an add-on URL is a link to a dedicated Learn More page that should explain what your connector does and the data that it accesses. Additionally, this page must contain or link to your terms of service and privacy policy. So for that, I am going to use my GitHub repository. And again, this is, if you wanted something a little bit more official, you could create your own web page, and then you would definitely want to include, again, the terms of service and privacy policy. But again, just for the simplicity of this episode, I'm going to use this GitHub repository, which is perfectly fine as well. And then paste that right there. All right, I'm going to actually use the same repository URL for the support URL. So the support URL is a link to the support page. If any users need to report issues with your connector, they can do so at that link. All right, so that is all of the required data that we need for our Data Studio appsscript.json manifest file. So let me save that and get started on building the community connector itself. So when users go to Data Studio and they want to use your community connector, the first function that's going to fire is this one right here that's called getAuthType. So sometimes when you are accessing data across the internet, you're going to need some additional authentication in order to access that data. Sometimes you won't, though. Sometimes you're accessing public APIs and public data that anybody can access, and in that case, you won't need an authentication. So let's go through that process flow first. So again, if your community connector doesn't require any additional authentication to access that data, then what you would do is access your community connector object, and then you would say new auth type response to get an auth type response object. And then you would set the auth type by using this method right here, setAuthType. So the auth type is going to be in enum off of the auth type enum right here interface. All right, and then there's different types of authentication types that you can set. Again, we've seen if we want to have no authentication type, we can select none. But if we have an OAuth2 process flow, we would select OAuth2. Maybe we want the user to input their username and password, or maybe they have an API key, but we'll go over some of those in later episodes. All right, so again, we're going to start off with none, and then you need to finish this by saying build. All right, and then you also need to return this. All right, so this is going to return an object. Now we're going to build that object, and we're going to specify, again, there's going to be no additional auth that we need to configure with the user who is accessing our community connector off of the Nomics API. All right, so we have the manifest file all written out. We have all the required data that we need. And now we have our getAuthType function as well, all completed. So now we can actually deploy this. So to deploy it, we need to go to New Deployment. And then the type of our deployment can be anything. It can be a library or a web app, but I usually like to go with library. It doesn't really matter too much. We'll type in a description. We'll say Nomics Community Connector. And then all we need to do after that is just click on this deploy button. So the important data that we need to recognize and note is this deployment ID right here. So let's copy that to our clipboard. And now let's go into the Data Studio dashboard. So I'm actually going to remove that for now. And to create a new Data Studio report, a blank report, you just click on this plus right here. And the first thing that's going to do is prompt you to add data to your report. So again, there are a lot of pre-configured and pre-built out community connectors, such as for Google Sheets and Google Analytics. But sometimes, again, we want to, and these are all great, but sometimes we want to access our own custom data, say, such as from a Nomics API. So the first thing that I would recommend doing, again, of course, is to see if anybody has already built out a Nomics community connector. So it looks like nobody has before, so you're going to need to build it out yourself. So to do that, you scroll down until you see Build Your Own underneath Partner Connectors. So you'll just click on this, and then it's going to ask you for your deployment ID right here, which is what we just saw right there. So this will connect our community connector code to Data Studio. And if we paste that in and then click on this button, Validate, and then we'll need to scroll down, and if everything worked correctly, then the connector manifest will be valid, and then we'll be able to see now our community connector. So we'll be able to see the logo URL that we specified, the name, the company name, and the description. And again, if we needed more help, we can click on Learn More, and then this will take us to that GitHub repository that we specified in our manifest file. All right, so let's see if this is working. If we click on this, then it's going to first require the authorization. So this is going to just be for our own Google. This is just Google's own authorization, right? And we've seen this before. If we click on Authorize, then it's going to go through this process. We'll go to Advanced. And this only happens once, but again, it's going to say that we are connecting to an external service, but we knew that we're going to be using the URL fetch app. So we'll hit allow. And that only happens once, but once that happens, then it's just going to say click connect to continue. Again, there is no additional authorization that we need for this community connector because we specified none as our auth type. And if we go into our executions, we can see that indeed this function was fired getAuthType just now at 11:35, and there we go. All right, so let's go back into our editor. If we go into our Nomics webpage, however, we can see that this actually does require some additional authentication. It requires an API key. So Nomics is not available for just anybody to access their data. You need an API key. So that is exactly what we're going to specify here. Again, we don't technically need to specify in the auth type if we want people who are using, if we want users who are using our community connector to just use our own API key, we could just specify that in the getData function. However, if we want users of our community connector to use their own API key, then this is where we would set it right here. So we'll say, instead of saying cc.authType.none, we're going to say authType.key. So this key means API key. And we can use OAuth2 or maybe a username and password, but again, we're going to say key. So whenever you have an auth type that is not none, you should always set some help text, or a URL that specifies how to get or how to go through this authorization. So for that, I'm actually just going to use this URL right here. And I'm going to paste that into the setHelpURL method and then build that. All right, so this is a getAuth type of a API key. But if we go now into this documentation right here, the authentication documentation, we can see that we're actually going to need to declare a few more functions. So again, this function getAuthType we have already declared right here. And that was okay when we had no additional authentication. That was the only thing that was required. But now we have a API key that's required. So not only do we need the getAuthType function, but we need resetAuth, isAuthValid, and also setCredentials. So let's go declare them right now. I've actually gone and pre-written out all of this, again, just for the sake of time. So I will copy that and paste it up here. So again, these functions are going to be called automatically. These are named functions. You need to name them exactly like this. But now, once we say that we need an API key, then we need to save those credentials or that API key somewhere within our software, within our project, so that whenever we make a request to the API, then we have that API key in our project. So this function, I'm going to be going over all of these functions, but let's start off with setCredentials. So setCredentials is going to display, once we say that we need an API key, then it's going to display a dialog box right here in our Data Studio UI, and it's going to prompt the user to add in an API key. And then once they add in the API key, then we're going to get that key. We're just going to verify that it's an actual working API key by making a one fetch to the API of the Nomics API, and then if that URL request is successful and returns a 200 response code, then what we're going to do is utilize the properties service and save that API key within the user properties. And that just helps out because it doesn't expose the API key to the developer, and it just keeps it a little bit more secure within the own user properties. So again, we're going to set that property, we're going to set that key as a property, and then we need a way of saying we need a way of telling Data Studio that yes, that was stored correctly, or no, that wasn't. So again, if this response comes back with, say, a 404, we need a way of telling Data Studio that that was not a successful we did not successfully set those credentials. So the way to do that is, again, we need to build out a credential response. So we're going to say CC. Again, we're going to get our community connector object. And then we're going to say new setCredentials response. And the response that we're going to set is, we're going to use this method right here, setIsValid. And then we're going to need to say false. And then build it. And then we'll return that as well. So again, this is going to return a credentials response object, and it's going to be false, so it's going to be invalid. And we'll do the same exact thing for if it is a working API key. So if this call to the API was successful, then we need to say yes, that we have successfully set the credentials, and it is a valid credential. All right, so we're just going to, again, return this and say true for setIsValid. And now this function should be working successfully. So that is setCredentials. This function right here is AuthValid. Basically, again, validates whether the credential is working or not. So this isAuthValid function is going to be called a lot, and I'll show you in the executions log once we go through this process flow again. But basically, anytime we want to access this key, or we want to access data, we're going to be calling isAuthValid to make sure that it is indeed a valid API key. And then finally, we have this function right here, which is resetAuth. This is only called when you are disconnecting the community connector to your Data Studio report. So again, this is only called once in a while, whenever you are disconnecting it, and then that is basically just going to clean up shop. It's going to delete the API key which you have stored in your user properties. All right, that looks like a lot of code, but it should all be working right now. So let's go and try that out. So we're going to save this first, and then we're going to have to redeploy this because we made some changes. So to redeploy or to manage your deployment, you need to click on Deploy again and Manage Deployments. And then you need to put out a new version, so you'll click on the pencil icon, and then you'll click New Version, and then Deploy. All right, so this deployment ID should be the exact same as you had before, so there's no need to recopy it. But again, our deployment has been successfully updated, so let's go check that out now. We'll refresh this page, and then go back to our Nomics Community Connector. And here we go. So now we are being prompted with the credentials that we need to add. Again, we need to add that API key. Again, if we need any help, then we can click on Help, and then that will lead us to that website, which we specified as the help URL. But here is where we add in our API key. So I have actually got a API key down here, which we can use. And I will go and paste that now into our Nomics API key dialog. If I hit submit, then everything should be working properly. It's going to make that call to the API, and if that's successful, then there we go. Now it says click connect to continue. We are successfully authenticated, and we have stored now that API key in the user properties. So one important thing to note as well is when you are building this setCredentials or isAuthValid, it's important if you're making a URL fetch call or request, HTTP request, sometimes you may need to mute HTTP exceptions. And the reason for that is sometimes when you don't have a valid auth, or if before you've even set your credentials, it's going to make this request and it's going to come back invalid, right? Because the key is not going to be working, or maybe there's just no key stored in the user properties. So sometimes, again, with the Nomics API, this, instead of just returning a 404, it's going to return a 404, but then it's also going to throw an error. And then once it throws an error, then it will throw an error with this entire function, and then that will throw an error with the entire UI of the Data Studio, and that's just not a good user experience. So instead of just throwing an error, we want to mute those HTTP exceptions and just return a 404. And then with that 404 response code, we can just return false after that so that there's no errors that are thrown on the UI itself. All right, so let's go check out that executions. As we can see, we said getAuthType, right? And then we set the credentials. We got the auth type again, and then we call this function isAuthValid, right? So there's just a lot of different things that we are calling. First, we got the getAuthType, and then we had to check to see whether that auth was valid. We'd getAuthType again, setCredentials. So all of these functions are being called, and they're named that way, and we have to again have that same name just like this. All right, guys, that's all that we are going to cover for this episode. That was a lot, but we now are successfully authenticated, and we have our manifest working properly, and we again are deployed and published to this data studio. So in the next episode, we're going to be looking at this function right here, getConfig. It should be a little bit shorter and a little bit more easy to understand. It's just a few things for that, but again, we're going to save that for the next episode. But for this episode, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and be sure to check out the Patreon page. If you need a little bit more help with your own projects, I'd be happy to help out. And if you have any questions on this episode as well, be sure to comment them down in the comments below. All right, guys, again, that's going to be it for this episode, but I'll see you in the very next episode.